Today, I'm going to be discussing the dialectic inquiry of how we define good and bad art through a postmodern perspective. I chose this question because I already had thoughts and ideas about what constitutes good and bad art. Since all art, whether it be movies, games, music, modern art, or 100-year-old folk stories, is often considered subjective, yet we can all point out whether something is good or bad, whether it be Rebecca Black's Friday or Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody. It's relevant to every discipline to figure out what makes art good, and ask, can we define why it is good? I also want to speak about the mentality of modernist art, and contrast it with how we look at and judge art through a postmodern lens. Postmodernism was the rejection of modernism, and modernism was generally based on the evolution of society to reach perfection through idealism. It is built on the idea of universal truths to order reality. Modernist art, though abstract, was trying to reflect the world around it. Though having vastly different aesthetics, modern artists thought that art could be made objectively better. If someone had came along today and said that they had figured out a way to make music or film reflect the world objectively better, we would be quite skeptical of them. When speaking about modernists, we're speaking about people who at the time could make these kinds of statements authoritatively and mean it, and it's important to keep that in mind when discussing postmodernism. Aesthetics philosopher Roger Scruton said that the first effect of modernism was to make high culture difficult, and to surround beauty with a wall of erudition. Postmodernism abandoned the idealism and the idea of fundamental truths that were the principles of modernism. It emphasized the idea of personal experience and interpretation. This encouraged new ways of thinking about what art can be, and the mediums and methods which it could encompass. Postmodernist art showed off complex and often contradictory layers of meaning that could be interpreted in many different ways. From performance art to memes, it could all be considered to have artistic value. Visual artist Federico Barbina said, "There is no universal formula to create a piece of art. Everyone has to find their own path. Your traveling companions on this journey through sensitive places are fantasy, creativity, and inventiveness." So, how do we define art as good or bad? The subjectiveness of how I view art is not always well-founded. With pieces of art, more so additive pieces of art like movies and video games, we think we can articulate why they are bad. By additive art, I'm referring to art mediums that use primary pieces of art. For example, movies use acting, shot selection, script writing, that all make up the movie. By looking at art through cultural perspectives and objectives, we can see how we define art as good or bad. Shinji Mikami, director of the first Resident Evil game, chose to use a fixed camera perspective as well as tank controls in order to make the game scarier. He said that in this way, the player could hear the zombies, but not see where they were, and didn't have knowledge of where they are. The control scheme used in the game was considered clunky and frustrating. The limited movement meant that aiming weapons was difficult, and in a game where resources and ammunition are of great value, wasting those resources due to a limited control scheme, it's easy to assess that it is a bad game. This perspective is totally legitimate, but the clearly stated objective of the game director gives us a new metric in which to measure how good we think this art is. We can judge it based on how scary this aspect made the game. I would argue through the postmodern lens that if the objectives of the artist have been stated, then how well the artist achieves those objectives is how good or bad the art is, regardless of cultural perspective. But what if the art fails the objective of the artist? Is it good or bad? If I intend to write a sad song, and then the end product is Happy by Pharrell Williams, is it then bad? Well, we could view it as a failure, but regardless, if you played Happy for someone, I don't think they're gonna say it's a bad song. And this is mostly due to Western music aesthetics that we've become accustomed to. It's because of your cultural perspective that you think it's a good song. Let's look at a real-world example. A TikTok user named 50 Shades of Swag used the duet function to do a harmony to a cover of a song called As the World Caves In by Sarah Cothran. The harmony used was kind of dissonant, and she received a lot of hate for being bad.
Oh, girl, it's you that I with.
Now, that might not have sounded great, but as musician Adam Neely points out, that's just the ruthless upholding of Western music standards. If your musical ear was more attuned to intervals with non-Western pop aesthetics, like in music where these odd intervals are common, such as Bulgarian choral music, your cultural perspective would not view this as bad, but rather 50 Shades Swag's harmony as good. Just because art doesn't confirm your traditional aesthetics does not mean you can call it bad. All of this speaks to the subjectiveness of art when viewed through a postmodern lens. Based on your cultural perspective, you can look at anything as good or bad, and so can anyone else, and you both be right. The lack of objective standards, unless someone has given you the structure in which to judge art in, you cannot say anything is good or bad. But I do think you can say whether something succeeded or failed based on the intent.